We're going to take a look at problem 15-16, which talks about ways that we can allocate our overhead back to the profit centers, if you will, or departments that are using these services but are not directly related to manufacturing. So there's two ways to go about doing that. One is by using a single rate, which would look at both the fixed and variable components. And the other is to use a dual rate, which would break those components apart. So we're going to demonstrate this again through problem or exercise 15-16, which is on page 567 of our book. The first thing that what we're going to do is I've set up the information, taken all of this right from the problem. We're then going to go do problem part 1A, which asks us to calculate the rate based on practical capacity costs and allocate that way as well. So let's start part A. And again, we're going to use the single rate method based on practical capacity. So the first thing we need to do is we take the total costs in the pool, which we know are 15,000. The next piece that we need to know is our practical capacity, which we know is our practical capacity is 50,000 kilowatt hours, and our allocation rate we can then calculate. So we take the 15,000 divided by the 50,000, and that gives us, let's see, 30 cents per hour of capacity. So this would be per hour of capacity. Therefore, if we were going to actually go and allocate this, I'm just going to copy this down here. So I'm going to take this and copy it down right over here so we can finish out this problem. Now we're just going to apply this rate that we just calculated to each of these kilowatt hours. So for instance, we'll have this multiply. I'm going to make this an absolute value. So in that particular case, they would get $3,000. And then we'll total this, and this should equal the 15 that we started with. So if we were going to spread out these costs based on kilowatt hours in a single rate method, that is how they would break down. Now, number 2 in the book asks us to move forward and calculate using a dual rate method. And it says we're going to calculate it based on separate pools for variable and fixed. Variable costs are allocated based on monthly usage. Fixed costs are allocated on basis of practical capacity. So that's what we're going to take a look at right now. So in this particular area, we're going to look at variable cost. So our total variable cost in the pool, we were told, is $6,000. It says we're going to use this based on expected usage, which comes from the book. They're telling us that that's what we're going to use. So in this case, our expected usage is 30,000 kilowatts. And we'll calculate an allocation base for VC, variable cost, and we'll take 6,000 divided by the 30, and that gives us a variable allocation base of 20 cents per kilowatt hour, per hour of expected usage. Our fixed costs, which we're now do separate because we're doing a dual rate system, we'll take the total fixed costs, which we were told are 9,000. In this case, we're told that we're going to allocate this based on practical capacity, which we know is 50,000 kilowatt hours, and then we'll come up with an allocation rate. By taking the 9,000 divided by the 50. And this is based on per hour of capacity. Then we're going to go just do the exact same thing we did. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to copy this down just so that it's all right there for me. You don't have to do this part, obviously. You can set your formulas up so that they just reference that material. But to make it easier for me to explain rather than going back and forth, I'm going to copy this down. So in this case, we'll have our variable cost allocation, and we'll have our fixed cost allocation. So our variable cost is going to be based on the expected monthly usage. So we'll take the 8,000 kilowatt hours and we're going to multiply that by the 20 cents. And I'm going to absolute value this so I can copy that formula down. I'll copy it in a minute. We'll do the same thing for our fixed cost, which we're told we were going to actually allocate that based on practical capacity. So we take our practical capacity and multiply it by the allocation rate per hour of practical capacity. We'll absolute value that. And now we can just copy this block down. And we've just allocated it based on the dual method. And hopefully when we add this up, we know that it equals the total amount that we started with. So we're just prorating this cost back to our different departments, and we're coming up with a reasonable way in order to achieve that. So the answer in this particular case is 6,000 and 9,000 still, but the way that we've actually done this is a little bit different. So I'm going to total these. So this is the total cost, because I want to compare those between the single rate and the dual rate. Again, we know that that's 15. So now if I look at this, and the last part of this question actually asks me, which rate do I prefer and why? So I'm going to look at this and break this out a little bit differently, and I'm going to say single rate. Again, you don't have to do this part. I'm just putting them side by side so it's easier to explain and discuss rather than flipping all over my spreadsheet. Dual rate. We have our departments. Copy these down. Whoops, I should have moved that over. I'm going to do that in a second. Let me move these over here. Okay, there we go. So now I'm going to take this and let's see, copy these down. Whoops, this should actually go down one. There we go. And I'm going to take this. Just curious to see or to show, based on a single rate versus the dual rate, you do get different allocations. And that's because in the single rate, we've lumped the variable and the fixed costs together. So in the dual rate system, you can see that the way that those have been allocated is a little different. The dual rate method really does give us a more refined allocation of the power department costs. For instance, it permits us to use different bases for different cost pools. The fixed costs result from decisions that are most likely associated with the scale of the facility or the practical capacity, where the variable costs really result in decisions, for the most part, that would be associated with things like monthly usage. So in order for us to get a better base or a better cost allocation, it really makes sense to go with the dual rate.